What's up, everybody? I'm Damon Hatfield, and we're here today to talk about the future of virtual reality. I'm joined by several thought leaders in the VR space here in the IGN studio. Jason Rubin is head of Oculus Studios.
Correct.
Adam Orth has been making Oculus Rift launch title Adrift. And Ted Price here is with Insomniac, a very well-known developer making the VR game Edge of Nowhere, which you see behind us here. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me in the IGN studio today. It may seem like we're getting ahead of ourselves talking about the future of VR when it's really just starting, but it's definitely the talk of the town here at GDC here in San Francisco this year, and I think people have a lot of questions about this exciting new tech. So maybe you can sort of enlighten all of our viewers out there. First question is a very, very broad question. Why is virtual reality significant to the future of games?
Okay, well, we haven't had a paradigm shift in games in a long time. I think mobile was a paradigm shift, and it created a specific type of game and created a lot of new types of games. But in many ways, from a technological standpoint, it was a step back. So if you were a core gamer, although it opened up the game market, did a lot of amazing things, the games are great, it didn't push gaming forward. So the previous paradigm shift for me would have been the 2D, 3D shift, which was a long time ago, 95, basically, when the PlayStation came out and its competitive platforms. And that radically changed gaming and made people expect different things from games, opened up games that had never been made before, and changed the industry. Here we are, 2016, and we are launching a new way of exploring, interacting with gaming. And it opens up an entirely new set of games that could be made. It also improves games that have already been made. Lucky's Tale, for example, a character action game, very much like Crash from the 2D, 3D era. But playing it is a very different experience because you feel in there with the character. So the reason this is important, and the reason VR is so special and so many people are talking about it, is it is a major paradigm shift in the way that games are consumed.
Adam, what would you say?
I would totally agree with that, especially about the jump from when mobile was introduced and what VR, what I think personally what is going to happen with VR. From a creator standpoint, not really since, I guess, the PlayStation era have I felt like, I feel like a kid again. Like, it's so exciting to make stuff because everything that we know how to make is brand new again. Like, every little new thing that we do as developers in VR is like monumental, and having to relearn all those things and like making mistakes and then new fresh ideas coming out of that is so exciting. And it feels like for my team in particular, and what I see from the game development community is that it's like starting all over again, but nobody lost any of their power. And it's like we get all of these super fresh ideas and
New Game Plus.
Yeah, and also really not since mobile have I seen, and it's different, but the development community is so open and they're sharing everything, and like it's just totally free thinking and really collaborative. So the games that I see and experiences that I see on VR are, to me, more exciting and creative and interesting than maybe what's going on in the traditional game industry, because it's fueled by all this like new passion.
Anything to add, Ted?
Well, you guys said a lot. So you cover basically from a player's and general industry perspective. You're talking about from a development perspective. I'll talk about more from the being an independent studio perspective. I think you see a lot of excitement within the independent development community because the opportunities right now in VR are huge. And what I'm talking about is the opportunity to get in early on technology that is the Wild West. And you'll notice that there are not a lot of behemoths jumping in. Right? You've got companies like ours that are small, that are nimble, that are willing to take creative risks and try something. But at the same time, like Adam said, we're learning these really interesting lessons, and we're being faced with these problems that we have to solve to make our games work. And that's what we love doing. And by solving them, I think we're developing new muscles that help us as developers really differentiate ourselves. And that's key when you're in an industry like this.
Yeah, Jason, you mentioned the shift from 2D to 3D as being one of those paradigm shifts. And yeah, totally. The first time that I played Mario 64, like I could hardly even believe like what I was playing and that it was working and how immersive it was. So as a gamer, that's really exciting to me to think that we're like on the precipice of one of those paradigm shifts that only comes along once every decade in video gaming. But at present, the introductory cost to get into VR is not insignificant. Regardless of whether or not the investment is worth it, how much of a hindrance do you think that will be to the spread of this new technology?
Yeah, I mean, year one is an expensive system. These are expensive systems. We know that. Flat screen televisions were extremely expensive.
Sure.
Pretty much everyone has them in their home. It's hard to find a CRT these days. The price of technology comes down. We are just learning as hardware manufacturers how to get this incredible display technology on people's heads, how to do input in an appropriate way. As time progresses, we'll find better and better practices. The price will come down. So while yes, today it's easy to say this is a barrier, it's not a barrier for a long time. We've seen this happen 100 times. Like nobody would say the price of this cannot come down. And if you can't find someone who can say that, you know eventually the price won't be the hindrance. So then the question is there quality content there? And for me, that's the bigger challenge right now, is figuring out what the right kind of content for VR is, figuring out how to get to larger, more complex, more all-encompassing games that keep you really in the system for long amounts of time, bring you back and things like that, and getting those larger games. So that's what I'm focusing on, and I'm letting the price take care of itself.
Adam and Ted, while you're making a VR game, is the price in your mind, or are you just trying to make the best game you can?
Not for me.
Yeah.
And we're definitely focused on the content.
Sure.
And something interesting about where we are today, I think that it was a relatively easy transition from us in terms of our technology from more traditional games into VR because engines have gotten so much more powerful. So to be able to run a game at 90 hertz versus today versus say 5 years ago or 10 years ago is a much more straightforward process. Even though, as I said before, there are a lot of things we have to learn about how to design appropriately. So it's been a nice confluence of where tech is and having a new platform that allows us to take advantage of the cool things our tech can do that lets us make that content and really push the kind of things that we think people are going to be wowed by when they put on a headset.
When would you guess the price would hit that mass market sweet spot? To put it another way, when is VR the Wii?
Yeah, it's really hard to guess. That we all believe fundamentally that there will be a hockey stick. When exactly that hockey stick will happen is hard to say. I believe this first generation of software is going to it's just going to blow the socks off of people, how good it is and how different it is and how special it is. Having said that, when you get past 3 million, 5 million people and you get to the real mass market, they need a certain type of pulp game that we don't have this year. They need a polish that maybe a second or third generation game can bring to the market. These are first generation games. I think if the hockey stick happens at a time when those games exist, all the much better. Another reason not to race to get to millions. I'd like the software market to be there and be comfortable and have everyone understand the rule set of VR before that mass consumer comes in. Because they're less forgiving of the rough edges. The harder core gamer, the enthusiast, is willing to go into a game and say, this has rough edges, but I'm pioneering. Like, I'm in the beginning of the game, the game frontier, and this is worth it to me. I'm willing to accept maybe menus haven't been figured out very well, right? We don't have a best practices in menus.
Sure.
It's a little clunky to get in and out of it. Whatever it is, they'll get past it because of the joy of it. You don't get that when you get into the mass market. The mass market wants it to just work.
Sure. Yeah. Adam, you have something to add?
No, I mean, Jason kind of nailed it, but it is about, like, it's exciting to be first, and about taking those risks and really, like Jason said, being okay with it's not perfect yet, right? And it's just very exciting to have, like in our case for our game, like the thing that turned the thing that won me over. I mean, it wasn't even a win over. We got the first Oculus kits at the beginning of making our game, and I just wasn't prepared for a piece of hardware to be able to like touch emotions of people, and that happens in our game. And it was too important for us to not, pick that up and run with it. And I think that this first generation of games are so unique and so cool and different that it is going to make an impact on people. I think when people get these headsets in their houses and they start showing their friends, it's going to be a big thing. And like Jason said, the hockey stick, when that happens, that's hard to tell. But I don't think it's going to be this year, right? It's going to take a little time. And I think the kind of games that people are making now, when you get to second generation, the things that we're making now are going to look primitive, right? I mean, when I look at games like, Lucky's Tale and my game and Ted's game, they look great, they're awesome, but it's going to be sad when they're, a couple years old, and the things that we can't even think of the things that are coming right now. They're just going to be massive.
Yeah, Ted and I were there for the first generation of PlayStation games, and the stuff that came out at launch. Ridge Racer was an arcade port. Wipeout was actually one of the first games that came out that was new and did something that you hadn't seen before in the arcade. But if you look at that launch lineup, it wasn't that great in retrospect. Yet, as a gamer and being a hardcore gamer and always into games at the time, I played the hell out of those games. I had an amazing time with PlayStation the first year, and the games that came out got better and better. And then a year and 2 years later, Tomb Raider, Crash came out, my game, Gran Turismo, like massive games came out. That was the game for the mass market. That first set of games was rough around the edges. It was brilliant. I mean, those were pioneers. They got there at launch day. And if you go back to 3DO, which is even earlier in 2D, 3D, those games were really pushing the boundaries with 3D. But they were also really rough around the edges. It was that learning curve that took us to that year, the second generation, a year or two after PlayStation launch, same on Nintendo, same on Sega system, where the games really started to sing. And that's when the mass market said, I'm in, and 3D just took off.
Yeah, game launch lineups are notoriously a little shaky. The Oculus Rift launch lineup was revealed this week. I think it's super impressive.
It's amazing.
It's like 30 games coming
Absolutely.
out. Yeah.
It's absolutely incredible. But again, we'll look back on it and we'll say, this is now how you do a third-person character action game. This is now how you do first-person locomotion in zero gravity. There's a better way of doing it, because we will learn that from people. Developers will look at the games and they will say, we now have a better way of doing that, and we'll look back on these and say they were primitive. They were also awesome. Yeah. Primitive and awesome.
Yeah, there's a great variety in the launch lineup. Looking back at the 40-some year history of video games, do you think there's any traditional genres or game types that don't work in VR?
The interesting thing about VR is if you take VR from a pure scientific standpoint, it's virtual reality. So it isn't necessarily something different. It can encompass anything. And what I mean by that is we have Xbox Play inside VR. Right? So you can sit on a virtual sofa and play on a virtual TV an Xbox game streaming from somewhere in your house. We know Call of Duty is a fantastic game. We know Grand Theft Auto is a game. I'm playing Far Cry Primal right now. It's a fantastic game. We know Division is fantastic. These are fantastic titles. There's no reason why that game has to change or has to go away. There are reasons why it plays better in VR. I can give you a few of them. Far Cry Primal, which is a 2D game, would be really cool if it was 3D. And I don't mean the 3D that you see in theaters. I mean the 3D where if I go like that, I'd look around somebody in front of me and see behind them. It's like instead of a window into a 2D world, it's a window into a 3D world where I can look around. Maybe the TV isn't rectangular. Maybe the TV curves and it's more like a giant half circle or some sort of weird thing in front of me. The reason those games don't translate to VR is that the motion can make you feel uncomfortable. But there is a TV in the VR world that's comfortable, so there's probably something better than a TV in the VR world that doesn't quite get to true 360 VR that's comfortable. And so maybe those games don't change at all. They just improve, and they improve by going into VR, which gives them capabilities you couldn't find in a TV. If someone throws a club at me, why can't it come out of the TV and go by my head? Like, that's totally fine in VR. That's not going to make you uncomfortable. It's just when you're in a first-person game and you throw the grappling hook and it slams you against the wall and you're climbing up and the club hits you in the face. All of that stuff won't work. It'll make you feel like you're on a roller coaster, after 20 drinks. But it'd be fine if it was on this virtual television. So I don't think anything goes away. I think everything gets better. And virtual reality is that medium that brings its own new games, but also brings old games to the future.
Adam, Ted, do you agree? Is there anything you've thought of that you're like, I don't think that would really work in VR.
Well, I mean, our first conversation, Jason's and my first conversations were about third-person action games, and we were both looking at each other, asking, "Do you think this will work?" And the answer was, "We don't know," and we had to try it. And I think that's going to have to be the approach for everybody who asks exactly the same question: what won't work? Well, we really don't know until we actually get in there and start working with it and discover the rules that have to be modified for VR. But I think in the process of determining what those rules are, we discover a lot of new cool stuff that we would have never tried in more traditional approaches to games.
I think to add to that, I would also say that I think it's pretty. I think it's a little dangerous to say what the rules of VR are right now.
Yeah.
Like, I was actually going to give a talk about this at GDC this year, but I couldn't do it. And I see a lot of articles and people saying these are the rules of VR and how you have to make stuff, and I think it would be better to call them guidelines, right? Because I think once you start saying this doesn't work, we can't make this kind of game, then we're hurting everything.
Yeah, and I'm going to, I didn't mean to say rules, because
No.
that can be a bad word, but I think that's a really good point that we've learned at Insomniac as we've been developing VR. Our perception of VR and the guidelines that we expected to use at first have changed, given the acclimatization that we have experienced while playing more and more VR. And it's fascinating. I mean, it's really, you've shared with us studies that Oculus has done on how people's reaction to cameras and movement in VR actually ends up changing based on what they've experienced over a period of time.
Right, like for an example, in Adrift, there's many doors that you have to open in the game. And actually through working with Oculus, we found out that I had no idea that simulation sickness is cumulative. I had no idea. And we had just a little teeny tiny animation in first person on the door when you kind of open it like this. It really wasn't a big deal and nobody really complained about it. But we just took it out and all the doors in VR just kind of auto open for you. And we just had no idea about that stuff, and kind of throwing the rules are out is, I think, really important for people making the games.
You have to throw the rules out, but be cognizant of the
Right.
end game. The end game is to make the most comfortable experience you can. And simulator sickness is really not that scary. It's just like driving in the back of a car, looking at a book on a winding street. Your eyes see nothing moving. Your inner ear says, "I'm winding." Your brain doesn't know who to believe, and that creates an. This is the opposite. You're on a roller coaster. Your eyes believe you're on a roller coaster. Your inner ear is like, "I'm not moving," and that creates the same issue. So avoiding things that cause that problem in general is very good, but around the edges, there are certain things that work.
So for each of you, what is the single most exciting door that virtual reality has opened for you as creators?
Storytelling. I think giving us the incentive to try different things in terms of how we tell stories. For example, in Edge of Nowhere, we have hallucinations that occur where we actually put you in the middle of the story and surround you with images and animations that make you feel like you really are much more engaged, and that the characters are talking to you and not necessarily the character who is the protagonist in the story.
I would totally agree with that. I was going to say that, but also I'll say something else. I guess the sense of place, like, again, I've only made one VR game, so I'm going to reference my game. The fantasy of being an astronaut is like everyone can kind of get down with that, right? It's kind of, no pun intended, it's universal. And I look at we made Adrift 2D also, and I just don't know if I would have ever been able to make this game and have it feel so real, even though it's not real, but it's very different. Like, our 2D game is very good and it's immersive and it's wonderful and all that, but like the enhancement of the experience in VR, it's more than just being immersed, and it's really hard to explain that to people who've never tried it or seen VR. But it's got a magic that all of the big advancement in games have had over the years that you can't kind of It's just weird with VR because it's hard to quantify it. It's just, I mean, it sounds kind of stupid, but it's just magic.
I think the reason I got into games, and a lot of game makers get into games, is to create alternate universes, to create worlds that people truly believe in, and that's true in movies as well. Star Wars was what got me interested in making worlds. I ended up in games as opposed to film, but filmmakers are really excited about making worlds. The problem with making worlds through a screen is they don't actually ever become believable. They're beautiful, we love them, we want Star Wars characters and everything else. We don't actually feel like we're in Star Wars. Climbing a mountain would be a very frightening thing for the vast majority of the world that aren't mountain climbers. I think Cliffhanger, the movie, probably the opening scene, that horrible, Stallone, whatever. That movie did the best job of scaring the living daylights out of you about the height of climbing a mountain. The climbing game from Crytek, takes it to a whole nother level by putting you in VR. People start to play that game, and if they have a fear of heights, they have a really hard time playing it because of the fear of heights. People with fear of heights, they watch Cliffhanger and they're like, okay, I get it. I don't like mountains, but I'm fine watching it. They're not fine playing Climb because they believe it. VR puts you in the world, and that gives you a whole new ability to create an attachment to the world.
Right, when you play the Climb, it's terrifying. I mean, it's terrifying. I did this Everest thing a couple months ago on the Vive in a hotel suite in Vegas, and I know I'm standing on a floor that has carpet on it. I could not get my body to make the first step and walk across this rope bridge. I could not do it. I'm terrified of heights. And, it's insane how it makes you feel that way. But if you look at, like, I forget what Call of Duty it is, but the level with the ice picks, and you're in the beginning you're kind of climbing up. It's just that you can't compare what it is. It's totally different. You get the fiction. Yeah.
You're climbing a mountain, but you don't feel the fiction.
Right.
You don't fundamentally feel it. Sony did, I forgot the name of the tightrope movie that they did between the two Twin Towers.
The Walk.
The Walk, right.
Yeah.
They did a Walk VR experience.
Also terrifying.
Yeah, people were like, I just can't do this.
Yeah.
It's like there's no game where you're like, I can't do the ice climbing, I'm afraid of heights. But in VR, that actually happens.
But, like, if you can take that and imagine Lara Croft, like, going across the rope, like, kind of shimmying across it, and, like, that's just the next level where we are now.
And so it's not just fears, like your emotional attachment to a character when they look you straight in the eye, regardless of where your head is, and follow you around the room, is very different than the emotional attachment through dead eyes that are looking straight into the camera and don't have any idea who's out there. Everything changes and becomes far more real in VR, and this gives us an ability to take the consumer, to take gamers, places they've never been, and make them truly believe it. And that's what sucked me into VR, and I think it's what sucks a lot of game developers into VR, is the ability to really get the player that they're making the game for to feel it.
So, considering that new level of immersion, to get political for 1 second, do you worry at all about another, like, video game witch hunt? If some opportunistic sensationalist politician wants to, like, talk about murder simulators and what kids are doing in VR, has that even occurred to you yet?
It's almost inevitable, right? I've written comic books, made video games, I listen to heavy metal. I've been through this so many times, like, it's just, but like all other medium, there is too much, there is using it in a wrong way. Certainly Oculus is a curated store. We're not going to allow porn, we're not going to allow extreme violence, we're not going to allow racism, we're not going to allow, you can think of Facebook's terms of service, like, we're not going to allow that stuff out there. But even, from a filmmaker's perspective or a game maker's perspective, what might have been a 6 out of 10 in a horror movie is like a 10 out of 10 in a VR game. So you have to tone down your jump scares. You have to tone down things that you're doing, and just be cognizant of the fact that it is that believable and it is that real.
Adam and Ted, how do you have to approach game development differently when you're making a VR game as opposed to a traditional game?
No idea.
No? Oh, yeah.
we made Adrift 2D and VR in parallel, which I don't recommend to anyone doing. It's very hard. And, my whole team's made AAA games for our whole careers, and, there's a certain amount of things that just based on your experience and what works, and there's a lot of, like, holy shit, I have no idea what I'm doing. And there's a lot of peering around in the dark, but when you find that, like, those things, it's like, it makes it all worth it. So, yeah, it's really hard to kind of, actually answer that question, because it's so new.
Ted, you've been making games for a long time.
I'd say two things really stood out to us as being requiring a different approach. One was camera, because we've been making third-person action games for a long time, and we're used to approaching camera in a very specific way. And the second was space layout, because when you are working, at least in our case, in a third-person action game, where you allow the player to go affects the player's experience in VR. Because you're asking, for example, in traditional games, if it's a free-roaming open-world game, you're telling the player, we want the character to go forward and back and side to side, but because the camera is your head in VR, if you're asking the character to turn like this through an environment, you're asking the player generally to do this in their seat, and all of a sudden they start getting wrapped up.
Interesting.
And we learned that very early, that we had to create the illusion of that same freedom of space. I guess you can go anywhere in this space without creating those physical challenges when you're actually wearing a headset. And it took, as you remember, it took a lot of different approaches before we could get just simple moving across the screen correct, or coming back into the screen correct. But again, for us it was fun.
Sure.
It's that creative problem solving which is so exhilarating in game development, and having new problems like this to solve, I think really gets the team jazzed, because you feel like you really are doing things that very few other people have done before.
And that's going on in every game that's being made multiple times in multiple ways. We just had Gamer Day, and we were talking about all the games that were there, and one of the journalists I was speaking to said, okay, you keep saying this. What did that game do that's different? And I said, and he goes, okay, that game. Yeah, that game. Yeah, that game. Like literally, as you go down, I could point to something brilliant and new that had to be discovered to make the game that was being pointed at work in VR for every title until he gave up.
So just to satisfy my own curiosity, something like Lucky's Tale, a third-person platformer in VR, what was something that they learned that they had to approach differently?
There was a huge number of things that they learned, and actually because Lucky's Tale was so early, a lot of their education came back to the game developers that came after them, because they were before everybody else. There was CCP, there was Lucky's Tale, and your game was very, very early. Adrift is very early. But the way the camera moves in that game in Lucky's Tale is nothing like what a Spyro or a Ratchet or a Jack or what any other free roaming camera would have done. If you fall, the camera doesn't race down with you; it'll slowly follow you. The camera tends not to rotate around at all. The camera in that game is very mellow compared to a lot of other games. You'll never have the camera turn around and come backwards when you run backwards. It just doesn't do that, because that turn is when your body just is doing things that your inner ear isn't seeing, and it doesn't work. So the amount of camera work alone that went into Lucky's Tale was massive. And then I wish the developer were here, they could tell you 100 other things you did, but that comes through most clearly as what they did with the camera. And how they placed the level then had to be dictated by where the camera could and couldn't go. You can force cameras in Jack or any of the much more modern third-person character action game. If you want them to go in a hall, you just put the camera behind them and have it travel down the hall. So you can't do hallways at certain angles in Lucky's Tale because you can't rotate the camera to go down the hall. So the whole world is cognizant of how the new camera system works. It's fundamentally a massive challenge that they solved. So literally every title went through that, and the conversations back and forth with Oculus, is this working, is this not working? It's just a lot of work and a huge outcome for them.
Now what about augmented reality? How does that fit into this paradigm shift? Is this something that's interesting to you? Is this something you're thinking about?
Are you working on any augmented?
We're not working on any augmented stuff. I have a real hard time personally, like wrapping my head around what that is, because I'm very interested in, like what Jason was bringing up earlier, is creating worlds and being immersed in that. So the idea of I can play Minecraft on this table in my living room, that's pretty cool. But it doesn't excite me personally as much as VR does. I'm sure I'm going to be proven wrong by that, and I'm sure I'll end up making something eventually. But right now, I'm really focused on learning how to, get better with VR. Yeah, it is interesting, but
I'm extremely interested in augmented reality. And I believe that VR is absolutely going to change how players view immersion and what games can be to players. But I think augmented reality has an even broader reach when it comes to its just ease of entry, because you're talking about combining what we're seeing right here with simulated reality and mixed in a way that is hopefully believable. So obviously we're super early. The very few companies have actually put any real stakes in the ground out there, because everything's sort of in prototype mode. But I look at game design and augmented reality, and I think just like virtual reality, it presents another completely new set of design opportunities for game developers to take real life and combine it with what's in our heads. And I see both virtual reality and augmented reality, actually virtual reality, augmented reality, and traditional game development moving along these sort of parallel paths and just broadening games' appeal in terms of how we just appeal in general, globally. So yeah, I'm excited.
That's good.
Speaking personally as opposed to for Oculus, I'm also really excited for it. I mean, there is probably a world, it's relatively distant, but there's a world where you're playing whatever game of the day in virtual reality and you're in another universe and a little thing pops up and says, you got to go to work. The screen suddenly shows through, and then all of a sudden it turns into augmented, or things start helping you in the world with information that wouldn't have otherwise been there. And where's the stapler? If we still use staplers, because we don't even use paper at Facebook anymore, but the stapler highlights is a bad example, or whatever. Like there's so many things that augmented reality could really help. And I think eventually it's all one unit. There's no reason to have two units.
Yeah.
Right now,
I agree.
the challenge of creating VR, as you're seeing with the price points and the delays, unfortunately, across the industry, it's very hard. Augmented reality, in many ways, is harder, and that's why you haven't seen much launch, and the price points are so much higher, because fundamentally, you're walking around and seeing other people. It's got to look sexy. It's also got to be portable. It's got to it has so many additional challenges that are being solved by some very good companies. It'll take a while, but it's going to be awesome. And then it'll take even longer for the two of them to be able to be in one device.
Yeah. But when that happens, I mean, that is the sort of holy grail of entertainment.
Yeah, and clearly we both have young kids. I don't know if you have kids, but our kids, this is their life. Like when they get to our age, this is all.
Yeah, they're just going to grow up with it.
Yeah.
I mean, I Instagrammed a photo of my daughter with a Vive headset on and things, and Cliff Blazinski actually made a shirt with my daughter on it, and it said "Future," and that's exactly what it's going to be. Like, flat screen TVs are not going to be part of our kids' lives. It's going to be all of this kind of virtual information that personally to me is super exciting. I can't wait.
Two more questions today. While everyone is talking about VR, is there anything that people are not talking about about VR that is exciting to you? Something that's significant that people aren't really talking about yet? If we got it covered.
Yeah, I think the challenge with VR is that unless you've put it on, you really don't understand the difference.
Sure.
So we throw around terms like presence and putting you in the environment, making you believe, and all these other things. And the challenge of something like this interview is that if the person hasn't had access to a Rift or a Vive or PlayStation VR or what have you, they just don't feel it. Like they don't understand it. It's when you put the person in the device for the first time that they get it. You put them at the edge of a virtual building and ask them to walk off, and they can't, which was the first demo that I was put through, and a demo that I gave 1,000 times. That's when people become believers. When you walk across a desk in a social app, and the person that you walk up to, you walk right through the desk because the desk doesn't exist, and the person gets back, and you ask them, why were you scared? I'm a floating blue head and toy box, one of our demos. When clearly I'm not going to attack you. Like you were pushing things through your hands that you're not physical. And they say, I don't know. I just didn't know. It's like I didn't know what to do. Just like when you walk up to somebody in a bar and you get in their face, they're like, "Is this an attack? What is this? You're up in my space." That happens in VR. It never happens with the television.
Yeah.
So it's those little subtle things that make people believe. And I think what we haven't really done is put it on everyone's head, and that's the next few years once these devices launch.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think about, like, a lot how we get people to experience VR. Like, you know, I a lot of my game developer friends, we talk about, like, and maybe you can talk about this, Jason. I don't know what the plans are, but, like, how do we get consumers in actual retail stores to have good VR experiences, right? And it's not about having the guy at GameStop come out from behind the counter and push reset, right? It's you have to have somebody there who knows what they're doing, and it's got to be a good, you know, like the Oculus event was a great example of having people who know what they're talking about and are knowledgeable about VR and kind of explain the onboarding system and just getting people, you know, getting the headsets on them, because nothing is going to kill VR faster than walking up to a kiosk in Best Buy where the headset's dangling off and something's spinning around, the screens don't work right. So,
It'll happen.
I'll add something that I don't think has been talked about too much, and that's the shared VR experience. And I think part of that has to do with our focus right now on just the launch of the VR devices. But once we have more of a critical mass of installed users out there, then we start to solve the problems that involve person playing together in VR. And I had that experience with Toybox that you mentioned back at E3, and it was transformative for me. Being in that demo and having another player in another room handing me something or tossing me something I could catch or shooting at me was like nothing I'd ever experienced in games before.
Yeah, that was incredible.
Yeah, and that just is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we can do when we play with others in this virtual space. And I don't think many people have talked about it yet, but it's coming.
Let alone implemented it, right? The difference between walking up to a virtual character that's doing this, and they don't have the head interaction of a real character. It's just different. And then bringing up a menu, offering a sword as a trade. They bring up a menu, and there's this, stuff going on versus just saying, "Would you like to buy my sword?" And they go, "Here, have some cash," and you trade and walk away from each other. Like, I haven't seen that in a game yet, but it's totally going to happen.
Yep.
You've seen it happen in Toybox by handing somebody something.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
And that's one of the things that I think ultimately is going to help separate VR from more traditional approaches, because yes, you can play co-op in your favorite traditional game, but playing co-op in a VR game, I think, is going to be yet another facet of games that just draw more people in and make them realize, wow, games really are deep. I mean, there's this social connection that you cannot get through any other form of entertainment.
Last question today. As these 3 VR platforms launch this year, if that's the first step, what's the next step that you're looking forward to for VR? The next significant milestone?
That's a great one.
Someone, the last one.
I've been working so hard on this launch.
Yeah, I know.
Just getting to GDC and launching in a couple of weeks. I think what you need to see is a few really, really highly received pieces of software come out that people start talking about on the internet and talking on Reddit or wherever they're doing it, and have people say, "I really need to go see that. I want to see this." Beyond just looking at a screenshot, because you can't look at a screenshot, you can't look at an online video of a VR game, you just can't. We have a real challenge there. But say, so many people are talking about this, I really want to see it. And to take the effort to go find one. Which of my friends on Facebook might have a headset, or where do I go that I can see it in a retail store, and make the effort to go see it? That's when things are going to happen. And it won't be this nebulous, there's a lot of games, they're good. It's got to be, this thing speaks to me. This game, it's my kind of thing, and everybody seems to love it. I need to get off my sofa and go find this thing. That's when it's going to start to take off. It's
got to be like a Grand Theft Auto 3 moment.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So for me, it's going to be when a VR game wins Game of the Year at the DICE Awards.
Ooh, yeah, that'll be it. Yeah. That's a really good point. Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming by today. It's very exciting times. As we were talking about at the top of this talk, these sort of paradigm shifts, 2D to 3D, online gaming, mobile gaming, they just don't come along very often in a gamer's life, maybe once every 10 years. So it's very exciting to think that we could very well be on the precipice of another big change for us. So thank you again, Jason,
Thank you.
Adam, Ted. Very exciting times. And for everything on virtual reality, stay tuned, IGN.